I remember the letter because it was written in ink as black as crows. It came in early May of 1933, just as the spring rains cleared from Berlin and the city began to hum with its new, strange energy. Hitler had been chancellor for 3 months, and the streets were plastered with red banners and crooked black crosses. The cafes where my fellow scholars once debated Wagner and Goethe had fallen quiet. Everyone now spoke in whispers, or not at all. The letter found me at the Prussian State Library, where I worked part-time cataloging medieval manuscripts for a pittance. It was folded into a cream envelope stamped with a wax seal, a stylized black sun wheel I didn't recognize. Inside, a few precise lines in immaculate Gothic script. Herr Albrecht Weiss, your recent treatise on Germanic myth cycles has come to our attention. We are a circle of like-minded men devoted to preserving and reviving our ancestral spirit. We believe you may be of use to the fatherland in the new era now dawning. If you are interested, come to the address below at midnight on the 10th of May. Do not speak of this to anyone. It was signed only with an ornate rune, a tiwaz, the old rune of the spear. I turned the page over and over, half amused, half intrigued. I was 27, a newly minted historian with empty pockets and grand theories about Germanic antiquity. I'd spent years poring over sagas and runestones, dreaming of reviving a lost age of heroes. Now the world seemed to be shifting in exactly that direction, and I was standing still. So at midnight on the 10th of May, I went. The address led to a mansion on Pariser Platz, a stone's throw from the Brandenburg Gate. Its windows were dark, but a single lamp burned over the door. A tall man in a black suit opened it before I could knock. His hair was close cropped, his eyes sharp and pale. Name? He asked. Weiss. Albrecht Weiss. He nodded once and let me in. The air smelled of wax, smoke, and old stone. The entry hall was lined with shields, swords, and black and white photographs of men in strange uniforms. Prussian, I thought, but older, almost medieval. I was led through a series of curtained rooms until the walls opened into a great circular hall. There were perhaps 20 men gathered there, sitting in high-backed oak chairs, arranged around a black marble table inlaid with runic sigils, candles gutted in iron sconces. The windows were draped in heavy crimson curtains, and above us, the ceiling was painted with a vast black sunwheel, 12 radial arms spinning like a frozen storm. The men wore tailored black suits or early SS uniforms with silver piping. Each wore a pin on their lapel, a white disc bearing a black hooked cross entwined with runes. At the far end sat a narrow man with wire spectacles and a perfectly waxed mustache. "Welcome, Herr Weiss," he said softly. "We are the Thule-Gesellschaft." The name struck me like a thunderclap. I had read whispers of them, an occult society that had flirted with power before the war, dabbling in Germanic mysticism, Nordic paganism, and nationalist politics. I had assumed they were long gone, relics of the mad post-war years. Yet here they were. They spoke to me as if they had known me for years. They cited my recent monograph on the Eddas, quoted my passages on Wotan and the spear sacrifice, praised my attempt to recover the Aryan spirit from the ashes of Rome. I felt heat rise to my face. Praise was a rare currency for me, and here it flowed like wine. They spoke of bloodlines and myth, of Atlantis as the cradle of Aryan man, of runic archetypes imprinted in the soul of the folk. One claimed the stars themselves traced ancient runes on the solstices. Another whispered of hidden vaults beneath the Alps, holding relics from the Hyperboreans. It was nonsense, of course. Beautiful nonsense, but wrapped in enough familiar scholarship to seem possible. Then they spoke of the new Reich, how the old world was dying, how Germany would rise reborn through blood and spirit, how the Führer was the vessel of a destiny older than Christendom, older than Rome, an avatar of the ancient warrior kings. I remember thinking, they are mad. And I remember thinking, they might be right. When the candles guttered low, they led me into a smaller chamber, lit only by a ring of torches. In the center stood a stone altar engraved with runes I recognized from Bronze Age stones in Uppsala. A man in an SS uniform stepped forward, holding a ceremonial dagger etched with the black sun. His eyes were pale and glassy, his voice a whisper. Blood remembers. One by one the others pricked their fingers and let a drop fall onto the stone. The blood hissed as if the altar drank it. When they offered me the blade, I hesitated. Then I thought of my empty flat, my unpaid debts, the manuscript gathering dust on my desk. And I pressed the tip into my finger. The altar drank my blood too. "Welcome, brother," they said. I left near dawn, stumbling into the cold Berlin air, the eastern sky just starting to pale. The streets were empty, the Brandenburg Gate looming like a black archway behind me. I walked home with my finger still bleeding, and the sense that I had stepped through a door that would never open back the other way. His summons came not on paper this time, but in the form of two men in black. They appeared in my lecture hall at the University of Berlin on a gray January morning in 1935. As the wind rattled the tall windows, and my students huddled over their notebooks, the taller of the two stood at the back, hands behind his back, while the other strode forward down the aisle with military precision. "Dr. Weiss," he said, not asked, "you will come with us." No one else spoke. The only sound was the scrape of boots as I followed them out. We drove through snow-choked fields westward for hours, Berlin fading behind us. The men said nothing. They wore black SS uniforms, the new cut introduced last year. High-collared tunics, silver runic flashes on their collars, black peaked caps. They seemed carved from obsidian. As the car climbed the hills of Westphalia, the fog thinned, and a black silhouette rose from the white fields ahead. Wewelsburg Castle, a triangular fortress of pale stone perched on a ridge, its towers clawing at the winter sky. I knew it from old architectural surveys, a Renaissance hunting lodge, long abandoned. It had been rumored that Himmler had claimed it for the SS, but until that moment I had assumed it was a myth. Inside, the air smelled of cold stone and beeswax. The halls were stripped bare, except for black banners bearing the hooked cross and the sigil of the Schwarze Sonne, the Black Sun. The symbol glimmered under the torchlight. 12 radial arms coiled like frozen flames. They took me down to a vaulted chamber deep beneath the south tower. 12 men stood there waiting around a massive round table of black marble, inlaid with silver runes. Candles guttered in iron sconces. At the far end stood Heinrich Himmler. He looked nothing like the monstrous titan I'd expected. He was short, balding, with round spectacles perched on his nose. His black uniform was immaculate, the silver death's head on his cap gleaming like a grin. His small pale eyes appraised me like a collector assessing a rare coin. "Dr. Weiss," he said in a soft, precise voice, "you have studied the Eddas." "Yes," Reichsführer, you have read the sagas, the runestones, the old myths of blood and steel." His lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "And you know that they are not myths." A shiver traced my spine. He gestured for me to approach the table. Laid across it was a tapestry embroidered with ancient symbols. The Valknut, the Tiwas rune, and at its center, the black sun. It seemed to absorb the light around it. "We are building something eternal here," Himmler said. "The Roman Empire crumbled. Christendom is decaying, but we shall root our Reich in deeper soil, in the primordial essence of our people. The blood remembers what the mind has forgotten." Around him, the other men nodded silently. They led me afterward to a smaller chamber beneath the North Tower, the Obergruppenführersaal, the Hall of the Generals. The floor was a perfect black circle, polished like glass, with 12 dark marble columns around its perimeter. Above, a dome ceiling painted midnight blue showed a spiral of silver runes. In the center of the floor lay an obsidian sunwheel of 12 arms, the Schwarz-Sohn itself. I stood frozen as the torchlight danced across its black spokes. "This," said one of the officers, "is the heart of the new world." There was a silence so deep I could hear the blood in my ears. Something about the geometry of the place disoriented me. Perspective seemed to bend, distances slipping. I felt suddenly weightless, as if standing on the lip of a vast invisible well. Himmler stepped into the circle. He removed his gloves, placed his palm on the black sun, and closed his eyes. "This is where the empire begins," he murmured. "Not with rifles or factories, with spirit." When he opened his eyes, they were shining. "You will join the Ahnenerbe," he said to me. "You will seek the lost origins of our people. You will unearth the sacred relics of our blood. And you will serve something older than history I should have refused. I should have fled. But instead, I bowed." That night I was given black SS riding breeches, a tailored tunic, and a dagger etched with runes. The grip was black wood, the blade engraved. "Meine Ehre heißt Treue. My honor is loyalty." They took me to the crypt below the castle, a low circular chamber of cold stone. A single candle burned on a plinth carved with runes. Karl Maria Willigut was waiting there, the Reich's self-proclaimed spiritual advisor, the man Himmler called the German Rasputin. His long grey beard forked like a serpent's tongue. His pale eyes seemed to look through my skull. He pressed a drop of goat's blood onto my forehead with a bone rod and whispered, "Blood is memory. Serve the memory." Then the others placed their hands on my shoulders and spoke in unison, "Welcome, brother." I left Wewelsburg the next morning wearing black. The car wound down the snowy road as the castle loomed behind me like a black crown against the pale sky. I knew then I had crossed a threshold, and nothing on the far side of it was sane. The Ahnenerbe headquarters in Berlin occupied an old mansion on Hedemannstrasse, though mansion hardly fitted anymore. The Reich had gutted and refitted it with military efficiency. Whitewashed corridors, polished parquet floors, and the omnipresent smell of ink, disinfectant, and ambition. Banners bearing the black sun and the SS runes hung in the stairwell like watchful eyes. We called it the Haus der Ahnen, House of the Ancestors. I arrived there in spring 1936, summoned by an official telegram signed by Wolfram Sievers, the Ahnenerbe's managing director. His office was an immaculate chamber of glass cases filled with skulls. Dozens of them lined the walls on narrow oak shelves, yellowed with age, empty sockets staring like mute jurors. Tags identified them in precise Gothic script. Cro-Magnon, corded ware, Hallstatt, Slavic, Nordic. Sievers sat behind his desk like a spider in the middle of its web. Tall, angular, his blonde hair trimmed to regulation perfection. His eyes were a cold blue that never quite blinked. "You are to lead the racial anthropology section," he said without preamble. "We are proving the Nordic origins of the Germanic race. The Reich depends upon it." I tried to speak, but he was already sliding files across the desk. Skull charts, measurement calipers, photographs of farmers from Bavaria, shepherds from Norway, schoolchildren from East Prussia, all annotated with neat runic sigils. "You will extract the truth from the bones," he said, "and silence the lies of the Semitic mind." His voice never rose, but it pressed down on me like a weight. By summer, I was traveling constantly. Our section toured orphanages, alpine villages, and gymnasiums across the Reich. We set up makeshift laboratories in school halls, draping black cloth behind the children as we photographed them. Profile, full face, body. We measured crania with sliding calipers, catalogued hair color, eye shape, jaw angles, skin tone. The children sat stiff and wide-eyed as if awaiting a sentence. We told ourselves it was science, but deep down, I knew it was not. I watched my assistant, Rolf, quietly discard any measurements that did not fit the Nordic ideal. Children with dark eyes or wide cheekbones were simply erased from our files. "Better for them," he muttered once. "Better to be invisible." In the evenings, back in our hotel rooms, I would lay out the day's photographs on my bed. Blonde heads stared back at me like wax mannequins, tagged and numbered. I began to dream of them, rows of perfect Aryan skulls floating in the dark like pale balloons. It was Willigot who shattered my illusion of neutrality. He visited our lab in Munich one afternoon, unannounced. He swept in wearing a long grey cloak over his SS tunic, silver runes embroidered on the hem. His eyes glittered feverishly. "You measure skulls," he said, peering at my calipers with contempt, "but you do not listen to them." "I beg your pardon?" "The blood sings," he whispered. "It remembers. It speaks in dreams." He placed a withered hand on a child's skull from our display case, closed his eyes, and murmured a string of guttural syllables that I recognized as corrupted Old Norse. "This boy," he said at last, "was once a warrior of the Teutonic dawn. His spirit has returned." He smiled like a priest at the altar and drifted out again, leaving the smell of incense in his wake. Rolf laughed nervously. I did not. By late 1937, the Ahnenerbe had grown monstrous. What began as a coterie of eccentric scholars had become a sprawling empire of departments. Celtic studies, Nordic mythology, Germanic folklore, ancient astronomy, racial biology. Our offices hummed night and day. Couriers in black uniforms delivered crates of bones from museums in occupied territories. Archaeologists fanned out across Europe digging up burial mounds and stone circles. Their finds whisked back to Berlin before local curators even knew they were gone. I was ordered to catalogue a shipment from the Swedish island of Gotland. Vendel-era warrior graves. Inside the crates, skulls lay atop rusted swords and shield bosses like offerings. The bones were stained green from centuries of bronze. I caught myself whispering apologies as I lifted them with gloved hands, but the reports we submitted bore no such reverence. We stripped away uncertainty, nuance, doubt. Our language hardened. Evidence of Nordic racial dominance, we wrote. Ancestral continuity of Aryan type. We were no longer writing history, we were manufacturing it. At night, I found myself walking the museum halls long after everyone had gone. The only light the green glow of the exit lamps. I wandered among the glass cases like a ghost, staring at the skulls. They began to feel like witnesses, or judges. Sometimes, I thought I heard them whispering as the air hissed in the pipes. Not words, just the susurrus of ancient disapproval. In December, Sievers summoned me back to Berlin. "The Reichsführer is pleased with your work," he said. "We have proven the foundation. Now we must build upon it." He spread a map across the table, marked with red lines stabbing deep into the Himalayas. "You will join an expedition," he said, "to Tibet." I blinked at him. "Tibet?" "To find the cradle of the Aryan race," he said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I tried to laugh, but his eyes were cold steel. "Begin preparations, Dr. Weiss," he said. "We leave in the spring." And just like that, the skulls and classrooms of Europe faded behind me, and the path ahead pointed toward the roof of the world, toward myth itself. And something inside me whispered, "This is the point of no return." Berlin's spring of 1938 smelled of coal smoke and lilies. By then I no longer walked like a man. I floated like a soul carried by a current I had not chosen. The Ahnenerbe's headquarters hummed with frantic energy. Crates clattered down hallways. Cartographers hunched over maps of the Himalayas like gamblers over dice. Engineers tested oxygen masks and cold weather gear in refrigerated chambers. I was handed my passport, my Black SS papers, and a letter signed in Himmler's narrow hand. Dr. Weiss will serve as runologist and mythographer to the Schäfer expedition. He is to seek Aryan traces and Hyperborean heritage among the Tibetan highlanders. It sounded like a fairy tale written in steel. We sailed from Genoa in April, passed the Suez under a blood-orange sun, and disembarked in Bombay with the humidity pressing like a wet blanket. From there we wound north by train to the dusty plains of British India, the landscape shifting from sweltering rice fields to dry ochre cliffs. By July, we were climbing into the clouds. Ernst Schäfer led us, tall, square-jawed, with hunter's eyes that never seemed to blink. He'd stalked big game in Africa and jungled through Burma, and he carried himself with a cold, effortless authority that made even the SS men defer to him. Our group numbered 8: zoologists, ethnographers, photographers, and 3 SS officers who claimed to be logisticians, but never put down their pistols. We trudged on foot through mountain passes where the air grew thin and the sky went white. Yak caravan tinkled with bells. Tibetan villagers stared with unreadable expressions as our black-clad column wound past their stone huts. Willigut had given me a small leather-bound book of runes, which he insisted would resonate with the buried memories of the Aryan soul. I kept it hidden at the bottom of my pack like a talisman or a shame. We reached Lhasa in September. It was a city out of dream and legend, whitewashed walls and golden roofs rising from a sea of prayer flags, mountain peaks rearing like frozen waves beyond. Incense curled from temple windows. Monks in crimson robes spun prayer wheels that clacked like wooden hearts. Schäfer secured permission from the local authorities with lavish gifts, cameras, medicines, and polished Mauser pistols. Soon we were measuring skulls again, as if Berlin had followed us halfway around the world. We set up calipers on temple courtyards, while curious children gawked and monks looked on with amused detachment. Schaefer declared the broad-cheeked Highlanders to be degenerate descendants of Nordic migrants. He had already drafted his conclusion before we unpacked our gear. I watched him jot false figures in his notebook without hesitation. For the first time, I felt something like nausea. One night, high in the mountains beyond the city, we camped at a ruined monastery. Its stone walls were carved with spiraling mandalas, half buried by snow. Schaefer's men were snoring in their tents. I couldn't sleep. The stars were monstrous and close. Willigut's runes burned behind my eyes. I rose, clutching a torch, and wandered into the crumbling temple. The roof had collapsed, leaving only a circle of cracked stone pillars around the central pit that sank into blackness. There, carved into the floor, was a spiraling sunwheel of 12 arms. The black sun. Not exact, but close enough to make my scalp prickle. I knelt, tracing it with my fingers, frost biting my skin. And I thought of Himmler standing in Wewelsburg, speaking of blood and destiny, and for a moment it all seemed to align. The myths, the symbols, the stars overhead like runes cast by the gods themselves. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Looking for ghosts?" It was Bruno Bieger, our expedition's anthropologist, leaning in the doorway with a cigarette. His grin gleamed in the dark. "There are no Aryans here, Weiss," he said. "Just bones like everywhere." Then he laughed, sharp and hollow, and left me with the dying torch. We returned to Berlin in early 1939 to parades and trumpets. Schaefer presented our findings to Himmler in the marble atrium of the Reich Chancellery. Charts proving the Tibetans were diluted descendants of ancient Nordic conquerors. Himmler nodded as if it was scripture. I stood at the edge of the crowd, staring at the black sun on the floor, and realized every number in Schaefer's report was a lie. Yet the Reich devoured it eagerly, stamping our myth into its foundations like a rune into wet clay. Willigut embraced me afterward, his eyes fever bright. "You have glimpsed the cradle?" he whispered. "Next, we will raise the empire of the spirit." His breath smelled of ashes. That night, alone in my flat, I opened my field journal. Between the runes and sketches, I had tucked a single pressed flower from Lhasa, brittle and pale gold. I stared at it until the candle burned low. I could not decide which world was real, the one we had found or the one we were inventing, and I feared I no longer cared. The guns began in September. I heard them distantly from the train windows as we crossed Silesia. Dull, rolling thunder far to the east. Poland was dying, and the Reich was being reborn in fire. In Berlin, black banners hung like a forest of crows. The city no longer hummed with nervous anticipation. It roared with confidence. Columns of soldiers marched unter den Linden beneath a canopy of swastikas, their boots hammering the cobbles like drums of doom. And deep within the Haus der Ahnen, the Ahnenerbe scholars became generals. I was summoned to a meeting in the underground briefing chamber at Wewelsburg. The stone walls were draped with crimson banners, the air thick with torch smoke. Himmler himself presided, round spectacles gleaming. Around him stood Sievers, Schaefer, and half a dozen black uniformed officers I did not recognize. On the table lay maps of Europe scattered with pins and symbols, black sun wheels, runes, and curious sigils that looked older than any alphabet. "The British Empire," Himmler said, tapping London with one thin finger, "is guided by secret lodges. The Jews pull their strings from the shadows, and they guard ancient relics, remnants of the Aryan spirit stolen in antiquity. His voice was soft but carried like iron. We will reclaim them. He turned to me. You, Dr. Weiss, will lead the Sonderkommando for sacred artifacts. You will scour the old world of its lies and return our heritage to German hands. I opened my mouth to object, then closed it. In his pale eyes, I saw no question, only command. Our unit formed quickly, as if it had existed already in blueprint, waiting only for me to inhabit it. We were given black SS field uniforms without insignia, Mauser pistols, and sealed orders marked with the sigil of the Black Sun. We rode with the first wave into Poland. Warsaw was still burning when we arrived, smoke and ash drifting through streets, gutted to their bones. Civilians picked through rubble like ghosts. My task was not conquest, but plunder. We swept through ancient cathedrals and university archives, seizing relics, codices, and medieval reliquaries. I watched professors in cracked spectacles weep as we loaded their manuscripts into trucks. One of my men found a 12th century bronze sun disk in a ruined chapel, its edges warped by heat. I caught my breath. It bore 12 spiral arms, unmistakably akin to the Black Sun. We created it at once and sent it to Berlin. The priests called it a church ornament. Himmler called it a key. In early 1940, we were sent to France. Paris was not yet taken, but northern monasteries fell like autumn leaves. We scoured the Abbey of Saint-Denis by flashlight, boots echoing through halls where Capetan kings lay entombed. Dust motes danced in our beams like spirits. In a hidden vault we found Templar seals, lead discs engraved with the double horse emblem. Williget had spoken of the Templars often, calling them Aryan guardians corrupted by Rome. I slipped one into my coat pocket, unable to stop my hands from trembling. The Reich celebrated our halls as victories greater than battles. Photographs of our finds filled the pages of Das Schwarze Korps, captioned with words like ancestral return and awakening of the blood. But beneath the triumph, something darker stirred. Strange accidents began to follow us. One of my officers, Hauptsturmführer Kessler, tripped while carrying a carved stone idol from a ruined abbey in Brittany. He cracked his skull on the steps and died before he hit the ground. Another, Otto Braun, became obsessed with a golden torque we found in a Celtic burial mound in the Ardennes. He refused to let it out of his sight, sleeping with it clasped around his neck. Within days he was raving, scratching runes into the walls with his fingernails. We shipped him back to Berlin in a straitjacket. I never saw him again. At night, in our requisitioned chateau, I lay awake listening to the wind scrape the shutters, staring at the silhouettes of stolen relics stacked in the corners, like silent sentinels. It began to feel less like we were taking them, and more like they had allowed themselves to be taken. Himmler sent us new orders that winter to recover the Grail of the Aryans from a remote castle in the Pyrenees, a place once linked to the Cathar heresy. He claimed their fortress had hidden an ancient power before Rome crushed them. Sievers handed me the sealed dossier with a thin smile. "You see, Weiss," he said, "the war is not merely for land. It is for the soul of the world." His words were meant as inspiration. Instead, they chilled me. By the time we crossed into the snowy Pyrenees, I could barely remember Berlin. The world had narrowed to black uniforms, grey ruins, and the glimmer of gold in the dark. I told myself we were archaeologists still. I told myself history could be bent without breaking, but the truth had begun to gnaw at me. We were not studying the past. We were trying to resurrect it. And some part of me feared that if we succeeded, it might not let us go. I returned to Wewelsburg in the autumn of 1941, and it no longer resembled the place I had first seen 6 years before. Then it had been half-empty halls and ambition. Now it was a temple draped in black. The drive through Westphalia was silent, our car gliding past villages where church bells had gone mute. The castle loomed from the ridge like a stone claw against the iron sky. Floodlights swept its towers. SS sentries in black greatcoats stood motionless along the walls, their silver runes flashing under the searchlights like lightning trapped in stone. Even the air changed as we passed the gates. It grew still, like the hush in the moments before thunder. They had rebuilt everything. The outer yard was paved with black basalt stones engraved with runes. The courtyard was lined with stone eagles and banners bearing the Schwarze Sonne, the black sun, arranged in 12-armed spirals. Inside, the old Renaissance rooms had been gutted and reborn. The walls were clad in black oak. The ceilings were painted midnight blue with constellations traced as runes. Torches hissed in wrought iron sconces. The men who walked these halls no longer looked like soldiers. They moved like priests. I was taken to the Obergruppenführersaal, the Hall of the Generals. It took my breath. The floor was a perfect black disc, polished to mirror brightness, inlaid with the 12-armed sun wheel of obsidian. 12 black marble columns encircled it, their capitals carved with wolves and spears. Overhead, the dome ceiling glimmered with silver runes that seemed to swirl if you stared too long. I felt as if I had stepped inside a machine built to bend reality. Himmler stood in the center of the sun wheel, small and round-shouldered in his impeccable black uniform, hands clasped behind his back. Around him stood his chosen 12, SS Obergruppenführers, each in black tunics with silver skulls on their caps. They stood as still as statues. "Welcome home, Dr. Weiss," Himmler said. His voice was soft as snowfall. He led me down into the crypt below. The stairs spiraled steeply, the air growing cold and wet. At the bottom lay the Gruft, the ritual chamber, circular and windowless. The ceiling was low, the walls of bare stone, and in the center stood a stone plinth shaped like an altar. A single torch burned behind it, casting a black halo of shadow. Karl Maria Willigut waited there. I had not seen him in 2 years. His beard had grown wild, his eyes more fevered than ever. He wore a black robe embroidered with silver runes that caught a torchlight like ice. Himmler gestured to the plinth. "This is the center," he said, "the spiritual heart of the Reich." Willigut's voice rasped through the dark. "Here we will call back the blood." He pressed his palms flat to the stone and began to chant. Not words, but guttural syllables older than language, drawn from sagas and scraps of Proto-Germanic inscriptions. His voice echoed off the stone like distant thunder. The 12 generals raised their daggers in unison. The torch guttered. I felt the air press inward, as if the chamber was sinking through the earth. For an instant, the black sun carved in the floor above seemed to glow through the stone, faint and cold, like the shadow of a star, and I knew with sudden clarity. They believed this was real, not metaphor, not symbol, real. Later, Himmler took me to his private study. The room was small, paneled in black oak, the desk littered with rune charts and medieval chronicles. On the wall hung a portrait of Heinrich the Fowler, founder of the medieval Saxon dynasty. He was my former self, Himmler said quietly, almost to himself. In another life. He turned to me, pale eyes glinting behind the spectacles. Do you understand, Weiss? We are not building a regime. We are resurrecting a bloodline. He smiled faintly. I will awaken the ancient kings. I smiled back, because I did not know what else to do. That night I lay awake in my chamber, staring at the beams above my bed. I could still hear Willigut's chant, as if the stones themselves remembered it. Once, I had believed this was all theater, myth draped over power to give it grandeur. But as the torchlight flickered in my memory and the cold stone hummed under my feet, I realized something darker. They were trying to summon something, and I was no longer sure it would refuse. They sent me east in the summer of 1942, just as the fields of Ukraine burned gold beneath the sun, and the air was thick with the iron stink of war. By then, the Wehrmacht had thundered past Kiev and Kharkov, rolling toward the Don and the Volga. The newspapers spoke of victory as inevitable. The radio sang marches and proclamations. But the soldiers who guarded our train did not sing. They stared out at the endless black soil, silent and hollow-eyed, their boots caked with dried blood. We were the Kommando Weiss, a cultural recovery unit of the Ahnenerbe. In reality, we were treasure hunters in black SS uniforms, chasing the ghosts of dead gods through a living battlefield. Our orders bore Himmler's personal seal. Recover all relics of pre-Christian Slavic cults for transfer to Wewelsburg. Pagan shrines, idols, bones of Aryan origin. I wondered how one could tell the bloodline of a bone. No one else did. We established our base in a looted Orthodox monastery near Poltava. Its onion domes were shell-shattered, the icons splintered, the stone floors blackened with smoke. Ravens perched along the ruined cloister like silent judges. At night, the front thundered faintly on the horizon, a dull growl beyond the fields. By day, we dug. Villagers were rounded up and forced to guide us to ancient kurgans, burial mounds older than the Rus. We pried open their earth bellies with spades while flies swarmed and the villagers muttered prayers under their breath. Inside, we found skeletons curled like unborn children, bronze amulets shaped like suns and serpents, shards of amber, crude stone idols worn smooth by centuries of darkness. The smell of the open tombs clung to us for days, sweet, rancid, like rotting flowers. One evening as we unpacked our finds, SS Hauptsturmführer Keller lifted a carved wooden idol from a crate. It was a squat figure with round eyes and fanged teeth, its wood blackened as if scorched from within. He held it high, grinning. "Behold the Aryan ancestor," he said mockingly. "Our great-grandfather, the swamp demon." He tossed it to me. It was strangely warm. That night Keller's tent burned to the ground. No one saw how the fire started. His body was found curled around the idol, blackened like charcoal. No one spoke of it. We shipped the idol to Berlin the next morning, sealed in a lead-lined case. Our mission bled into slaughter. Soviet partisans struck our convoys in the forests, their bullets snapping from unseen trees. We burned villages in retaliation. I watched gray-haired peasants herded into barns and set alight, their screams thin as wire. My men said it was necessary. I said nothing, but the soil seemed to remember. Wherever we dug, the ground was slick with blood, as if the dead beneath were rising to greet the new dead above. At night, I dreamed of the idols climbing from their crates, their blank eyes glowing red like coals. In October, we reached an ancient shrine hidden in the woods near the Dnieper. The locals called it Perun's Gate. It was a ring of toppled stones around a black stone altar, half buried in moss. The altar was carved with spiral sun symbols, almost identical to the black sun in Wewelsburg. Willigut had given me a vial of goat's blood to awaken the stone. I poured it across the altar under the moon. The blood ran down the spirals like water. The stone drank it. The men stood silent, breath steaming in the cold. Someone muttered a prayer. I felt nothing divine, only a cold, hollow dread, like standing on the lip of a vast pit. 2 days later, partisans attacked. They came at dawn. Figures in ragged greatcoats screaming from the tree line, rifles flashing. My men scattered. The forest erupted with gunfire and smoke. I crawled behind the altar as bullets chewed the stones. Blood sprayed the moss. The air stank of gunpowder and fear. When the shooting stopped, the grove was carpeted with bodies. German, Soviet, nameless. Ravens were already circling overhead. We buried our dead in the same soil we had been robbing. I caught myself whispering to them as the dirt fell, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." That night I burned my field journal, all the rune sketches, all the measurements, all the theories. I watched the pages curl and blacken, the ink dissolving into smoke. My hands trembled. My heart did not. I had thought the Reich sought to uncover the past. But here, amid ash and carrion, I saw the truth. We were trying to resurrect it, and it was already exacting its price. The first crack was quiet. It came in the spring of 1943, buried as a single sentence in an internal memo. Standartenführer Karl Maria Willigut is hereby relieved of duty on medical grounds. No ceremony, no announcement, just erased. One day he was stalking Wewelsburg's halls in his rune-embroidered cloak, raving of ancient kings and the blood spirits whispering in the stones. The next, he was gone, vanished into a sanitarium near Salzburg, sealed behind walls padded like coffins. No one spoke his name again. But in the silence he left, the air in Wewelsburg shifted. The castle no longer thrummed like a living thing. Its corridors felt hollow, like stage scenery after the actors have fled. The torch sconces were cold. The marble floors echoed too loudly, and I began to notice the fear. The Reich was still proclaiming victory, but the fronts were bleeding out. The Red Army had encircled Paulus at Stalingrad. Our armies reeled backward across the steppe. Allied bombers scoured Hamburg and Cologne to rubble. Even inside the Ahnenerbe, the triumphal tone cracked. Sievers barked at subordinates like a drowning man lashing out at waves. Schaefer disappeared on mysterious field assignments no one could verify. Files began to vanish from archives overnight. Locked cabinets stood open in the morning, their contents gone like smoke. And the whispers began. The Gestapo is watching. The SS eats its own now. I found myself flinching at footsteps in the halls. In the autumn of 1943, I was ordered to catalogue a shipment from Kiev. The crates reeked of damp earth and old blood. Inside lay the idol we had taken from the Dnieper Grove, blackened, fanged, its eyes blank hollows. The note attached read simply, "Returned from failed study. Do not open after dark." The handwriting was Kessler's, but Kessler had died in 1942. I locked the crate and shoved it into the deepest corner of the archive. That night, the floor beneath it was slick with something like oil. I told no one. By 1944, the Ahnenerbe was coming apart like a corpse in water. Departments turned on each other. Celtic studies accused racial biology of falsifying results. Folklore accused Nordic mythology of unscientific ritualism. The hallways seethed with rivalries and whispers. A young archivist named Hauer approached me trembling, eyes darting like a hunted animal. "They are purging us," he whispered. "Sievers has lists. Anyone who questions the doctrine will vanish." "Doctrine?" I asked. He leaned close, breath shaking. "The doctrine that the Reich is older than time, that Himmler is the reincarnation of Heinrich the Fowler, that the Black Sun is the heart of the world." His voice cracked on the last word. The next day he was gone. His office was empty, his name scrubbed from the door. I began quietly sabotaging our work. It was easier than I expected. The chaos shielded me. I slipped false provenance tags into crates, mislabeled sites on excavation maps, and misfiled incriminating reports deep in the archives where no one would ever find them. Sometimes late at night, I burned entire folders in the basement furnace. I watched decades of forged Aryan history curl into black ash and float away like dead moths. No one noticed, or no one dared to. In February 1944, Himmler summoned me for the last time. He looked thinner, his face waxy, his spectacles fogged from his breath. He no longer radiated cold authority, only exhaustion wrapped around fanaticism like barbed wire around a corpse. "We are surrounded by traitors," he murmured, staring past me at the window. "The old powers are closing their jaws. Britain has its occult lodges. Moscow has the Slavic cults. The Jews, always the Jews." He turned to me, eyes glassy. "You are loyal, Weiss." "Yes?" I lied and said yes. He smiled faintly, the smile of a drowning man glimpsing land that isn't there. The last time I walked the Obergruppenführersaal, the torches were cold. Dust filmed the black sun on the floor. The 12th generals were gone to the front or the grave. Only my footsteps echoed. I thought of the first night I stood there, breathless with awe, believing I was touching the hidden heartbeat of the world. Now the place felt like a tomb. That night I packed my journals, photographs, and copies of key documents and smuggled them out of Wewelsburg, hidden inside a shipment of carved folk masks bound for Munich. I had decided, if the Reich fell, someone had to remember what had really been done here before it was buried under myth again. And if the Reich survived, I would be dead anyway. As the train rattled south through the snow, I sat among the crates of masks, wooden faces grinning in the dim light, and realized how easily a mask can become a face if you wear it long enough. I had worn one for 10 years, and I no longer knew what my real face looked like. The world was ending, and Wewelsburg was dying with it. By April 1945, the Reich was a carcass, gnawed to the bone. The Red Army thundered toward Berlin from the east. The Western Allies stormed across the Rhine, and the great black banners that once blanketed Europe now hung in tatters over smoking ruins. I had been hiding in Munich under forged papers when the message came. A single line scrawled in Siever's hand and smuggled through a dying courier network. "Burn it all. Do not let them find the heart." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. I rode north through a Germany of ghosts. The train clattered through bombed-out stations where shattered clocks hung frozen at midnight. Cities lay flattened into grey plains of rubble. The air stank of smoke and rot. Columns of refugees trudged along the tracks like broken marionettes. their faces caked in the grey dust of their lives. I reached Wewelsburg just as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the castle towers black against a sky the color of rust. No guards waited at the gates. The searchlights were dark. The great stone courtyard lay silent beneath a drift of fallen leaves and plaster. Wewelsburg, once the beating heart of Himmler's order, was empty. Inside, the silence was monstrous. The torches were cold. The banners had been stripped from the walls. Dust lay thick on the basalt floors. My footsteps echoed down the long galleries, like intrusions into a tomb. I passed the Hall of Generals. Its once perfect obsidian sunwheel was cracked, the 12 black columns scorched by fire. The silver runes on the dome had flaked away, leaving only ghost lines in the soot. Here, once, Himmler had stood with his chosen 12 and sworn to raise the empire of the spirit. Now even their shadows had fled. The archives were worse. Papers lay scattered across the floors like autumn leaves, spattered with rat droppings and mold. Cabinets stood gutted, drawers wrenched open, locks smashed. The air reeked of damp and rotting parchment. I found one room where someone had tried to burn the files in haste. The walls were scorched, the windows shattered, and half-burned fragments fluttered in the draught. Rune charts, skull measurements, expedition logs, letters in Himmler's precise spider hand. I filled my satchel with what I could, not to save them, but to know what must be destroyed. Then I descended to the crypt. The graft lay beneath the north tower, a circular stone chamber where the Ahnenerbe had once performed its rites. The spiral stair groaned under my boots. The air grew cold and wet. I reached the door. It was ajar. Inside, the altar stood alone in the torchlit gloom, grey stone streaked black as if it had bled. The walls were damp. Fungal moss crawled across the ceiling like veins. And in the center of the floor, the black sun still glimmered faintly in the dark. For a moment, I froze. It seemed to pulse, just once, like the dying heartbeat of some buried beast. Then it went still. I poured petrol over everything, the plinth, the ritual tapestries, the cabinets of relics I had dragged down from the archives, the bronze sun discs, the idols, the cracked skulls, all of it. I struck a match. The flame caught with a hiss, then roared. Smoke rolled up the stone walls. Tapestries curled and blackened. The heat scorched my face. The black sun on the floor warped and twisted in the waves of fire, its 12 arms writhing like snakes as the stone cracked beneath them. I stood and watched until the air seared my lungs. I half expected the altar to scream. It didn't. It only crumbled, slow and silent, like an old tooth dissolving. I stumbled up the stairs as the crypt filled with smoke. The castle shook with distant detonations. Not my fire, but demolition charges. Someone else had set them. On the outer wall, I found a plunger rigged with wire. A handwritten note dangled from it. Leave nothing. I limped down the hill and didn't look back. Minutes later, the night tore open. Wewelsburg erupted in a blossom of fire, its towers shearing away in showers of stone. A black cloud rose like the ghost of all the banners that had once flown there. And then the castle was gone. I walked west in the dark, wrapped in a stolen civilian coat, papers under a false name. Behind me, the last temple of the Reich smoldered like a burned-out star. The empire of the spirit had consumed itself at last. All that remained of it was ash, and the hollow thing that still wore my name. My name is not Albrecht Weiss anymore. It hasn't been for nearly 20 years. The papers I carry identify me as Johann Bauer, a quiet bookseller in Bremen. My shop smells of dust and glue, and the old men who come in for atlases or hymnals nod politely, without recognition. They do not see the ruin under the skin. They do not hear the stones whispering at night. I learned long ago how to move through the world like a shadow. I kept my head down when the Allies came, burned my uniform, bribed an American officer with gold teeth pried from a forgotten reliquary. I never married, never wrote again. The Reich collapsed into mud and memory, and I buried myself with it. Yet even now, in the quiet of my shop, I sometimes catch myself sketching runes in the margins of invoices without knowing I've done it. The black sun lives behind my eyelids, faint and spinning. In the spring of 1961, I read a small notice in a provincial newspaper. The ruins of Wewelsburg Castle are now open to the public. My hands trembled so violently I tore the page. I closed the shop that week, told my single apprentice I was going on holiday, and boarded the first train south. Westphalia had grown green again. The fields that once roared with panzer divisions now hummed with tractors. Children pedaled bicycles along lanes that had echoed with SS boots. The air smelled of cut hay instead of cordite. And there it was on the ridge, smaller than I remembered, bleached pale by sun and time. Wewelsburg, or what was left of it. The North Tower was a jagged stump, blackened from the demolition charges. The courtyard was choked with weeds. Swallows darted through shattered windows. Tourists in bright shirts wandered among the stone snapping photographs. They smiled, laughed. No one whispered. No one bowed. I drifted away from them, down corridors stripped bare to their bones. The banners were gone, the black oak paneling torn out, the floors swept clean. Only the walls remained, and they felt thin, like paper stretched over something still waiting underneath. I found the old stair to the crypt. It was blocked by a rusted iron gate, but the lock was feeble. I broke it with a rock, hands steady as a surgeon's. The air was damp and cold as I descended, the same cold that had lived in my bones since 1945. The gruft was smaller than memory. The altar was gone, the floor cracked and flooded with shallow rainwater. Moss crawled up the stone like veins. But in the center, beneath a thin film of water, the black sun was still there, faded, chipped, but unbroken. I knelt. My reflection hovered over it, a gray old man with hollow eyes, the shadow of the black rune spinning just beneath his face like an eclipse. Once this symbol had seemed eternal to me, a hidden engine that would turn the world forever. Now it looked tired, like me. I pulled my satchel from my shoulder. Inside lay the last thing I had carried from that collapsing empire, my journal. All that remained of 10 years of servitude and delusion. I had kept it hidden through the collapse, the camps, the purges, the decades of silence. Its pages were filled with runes, chants, expedition notes, sketches of skulls, maps to places that had never existed, a poison disguised as history. I tore the pages out one by one. They fluttered into the shallow water, ink bleeding like old blood. Then I struck a match. The fire burned quick and hungry, licking the damp air, curling the pages into black lace. Smoke drifted up through the ruined stair like the last breath of a ghost. The water hissed, the ashes sank. When it was done, nothing remained, not even my name. I sat on the cold stone until the fire died. Above me, faint light slanted through the cracked ceiling where the bombs had torn the world open. I thought of Himmler in his black spectacles, whispering of ancient kings, of Willigut murmuring that blood remembers. They were both bones now. Their empire was weeds. The only thing it had truly resurrected was death. I left the gruft without looking back. The swallows still darted through the broken windows as I stepped into the sunlit courtyard. A child laughed somewhere far away. I walked down the hill into the spring fields, an old man with an empty satchel, and the grass swayed shut behind me as if I had never been there. And perhaps I never was.